Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive.
This time, we're looking at something really fun
How to use popular movies as inspiration.
for creating really unique and interesting D&D campaigns.
We found this really great article
Okay.
called 10 Epic D&D Campaign Ideas Based on Popular Movies.
From the website LitRPG Reads.
Okay.
And we're going to really take this apart.
And see if we can give you guys
Some really practical takeaway.
for incorporating elements of these really popular films
into your games.
What's really fascinating to me about this is you're not just rehashing a movie plot, you're taking the essence of a world that your players already love and giving them the power to change it. Imagine their reaction when they realize they're not just watching the story unfold, they're living it.
So we're not just talking about running a game where the players are the Avengers.
Right.
You're talking about something deep.
Exactly. It's about capturing the spirit of the film, the themes, the feel, and translating that into mechanics, encounters, and a unique world that feels both familiar and new. So rather than saying, okay, you're all hobbits now and there's a ring, we're going to give you the tools to create your own Middle-earth, your own magical system, your own epic saga.
That sounds great. But let's back up for a second. Why movies? I mean, there are tons of sources of inspiration out there. So what makes film so special?
Think about it. Movies are incredibly immersive. They draw us in with visuals, music, characters we connect with. And so by tapping into that pre-built emotional connection, you're instantly boosting player engagement. It's like handing them a world they already love and saying, okay, now it's your turn to leave your mark.
I can see how that would get players excited. Okay, so let's say you're on board with this whole movie-inspired campaign idea. How do you choose the right film?
That's where knowing your players comes in. And the kind of campaign that you want to run. You might love gritty, noir detective films, but if your group is all about high fantasy, it's going to be a tough sell. The key is to find a film that aligns with their interests, and R&D has enough depth to translate into a D&D world.
So it's not just about picking your favorite. It's about finding something that's adaptable.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's say we found that perfect film. How do we actually go about adapting it for D&D? What are the first steps?
The first step is to really dissect the source material. What are the core themes? What makes this world unique? What are the iconic elements, characters, and conflicts that drive the narrative? Once you have a firm grasp of the film's essence, you can start thinking about how to translate those elements into D&D mechanics.
Okay, so for example, if we were looking at Lord of the Rings, we'd be thinking about the epic scale of the journey, the themes of good versus evil, the importance of fellowship, and the corrupting influence of power.
Exactly. And then you start thinking about how those elements manifest in a D&D context. That epic journey could become a sprawling campaign map with diverse regions. The corrupting power of the One Ring could be represented by a cursed artifact, maybe a dragon-controlling crown. That grants immense power, but slowly twists the wearer's personality.
Okay. That's starting to sound really cool.
Yeah.
But how do we make sure that we're not just copying the movie beat for beat? Because we want our players to have their own unique experience, not just relive someone else's story.
That's where creativity and a deep understanding of D&D mechanics come in. Let's take that dragon-controlling crown example. You wouldn't just hand it to the players and say, okay, now you have to destroy it. You'd weave it into the fabric of the world. Give it a history. Maybe even make it the centerpiece of an ancient prophecy.
So instead of it just being like a MacGuffin, it becomes a catalyst for the player's own adventures.
Precisely. You could create factions vying for control of the crown, each with their own motivations and schemes. Maybe one faction wants to use the crown's power to conquer the land, while another seeks to seal it away forever.
And the players get caught in the middle, forced to make difficult choices that will have lasting consequences.
Exactly. And along the way, they'll encounter challenges and obstacles that force them to use their skills and ingenuity. Maybe they have to infiltrate a heavily guarded fortress or negotiate with a cunning dragon who's been corrupted by the crown's influence.
Wow, this is really starting to come together. I can see how we can take those core elements from the film and spin them into a whole new story that feels both familiar and unique.
That's the beauty of it. You're building on a foundation that your players already have an emotional connection with, but you're also giving them the freedom to make their own choices and leave their mark on the world.
So we've talked about adapting the overall themes and concepts, but what about those iconic scenes and moments from the film? How do we translate those into D&D encounters?
That's where it gets really fun. Think about the most memorable scenes from Lord of the Rings. The Council of Elrond, the Balrog encounter in Moria, the Battle of Helm's Deep. Each of those scenes is packed with drama, tension, and memorable moments.
Yeah, and each of those scenes offers a blueprint for a potential D&D encounter. So instead of just having a random encounter with some orcs in a forest, we could create a scenario where the players are trapped in a crumbling dwarven mine, facing a fiery Balrog-like creature.
Exactly. And you could even incorporate some environmental hazards like collapsing tunnels, poisonous gas, or ancient traps.
Oh, and we could use music and sound effects to really amp up the tension and create a truly immersive experience.
Absolutely. The key is to think about what made those scenes so memorable in the film, and then find ways to translate those elements into a D&D context.
Okay, so we've covered Lord of the Rings, but what about other fantasy films? Let's talk about Harry Potter. How would we go about adapting a magical school setting into a D&D campaign?
Harry Potter offers a fantastic opportunity to create a campaign centered around a magical academy. But instead of just replicating Hogwarts, we want to create a school with its own unique identity, history, and challenges.
So it's not just about attending classes and learning spells. It's about uncovering secrets, facing dangers, and maybe even challenging the status quo.
Exactly. And one way to make your magical academy truly unique is to give it a compelling backstory. Maybe it was founded on a site of ancient power, or maybe it's harboring a dark secret that threatens to unravel the very fabric of magic.
Ooh, I love a good mystery. So instead of just having a defense against the dark arts class, maybe the students are investigating a series of strange occurrences that point to a hidden evil lurking within the school.
Exactly. And you could even create a rivalry between different houses or factions within the school, each with their own goals and allegiances.
Oh, and we could have a quirky and memorable faculty. Maybe an eccentric potions master who's always on the verge of a breakthrough, or a stern headmaster who's hiding a dark secret.
I love those ideas. Remember, it's all about those details that bring the world to life and make it feel real to your players.
Okay, this is giving me so many ideas. I'm already picturing a campaign where the players are students at a magical academy built on the back of a giant, slumbering dragon. And as they learn more about magic, they start to realize that the school's very existence is tied to the dragon's life force.
Yeah.
And then, oh man, this is going to be epic.
I can't wait to see what you come up with. But before you get too carried away, let's talk about how to handle something that's central to both Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter, the idea of a fellowship, or a close-knit group of friends facing challenges together, because that's a key element of many D&D campaigns. But how do we make sure that it feels organic and authentic, not forced or cliched?
That's a great question, because we don't want our players to feel like they're just playing out a predetermined script. We want them to feel like their characters' relationships are genuine and earned. So how do we achieve that?
The key is to focus on character development and interaction. Don't just throw your players together and expect them to instantly become best friends. Give them opportunities to interact, to learn about each other's backgrounds, to share their hopes and fears.
So instead of just starting the campaign with, you all meet in a tavern, maybe we have them meet in a more organic way. Maybe they're all attending the same festival, or they're all witnesses to a crime, or they're all passengers on a ship that gets attacked by pirates.
Exactly. And then as the campaign progresses, give them opportunities to bond over shared experiences. Maybe they have to work together to overcome a challenging puzzle, or they have to defend each other against a dangerous enemy.
And as they face those challenges together, their relationships will naturally deepen and evolve.
Exactly. And don't forget about downtime between adventures. Those moments of quiet reflection, where the characters can just relax and interact with each other, are crucial for building strong relationships.
So maybe they spend an evening sharing stories around a campfire, or they help each other with chores, or they just hang out and play games.
Those seemingly mundane moments can be just as important as the epic battles and daring quests when it comes to building a sense of camaraderie among the players' characters.
Okay, I'm loving all of this. But what about genres that feel further from traditional D&D? Like, how would you go about adapting a sci-fi film like Star Wars into a fantasy setting? Lightsabers, the Force. That seems tricky.
It might seem tricky, but that's where the real magic of adaptation comes in. You don't have to translate things literally. Instead, think about the thematic equivalents. The Force, for example, is essentially a magical system with light and dark sides.
So instead of having Jedi and Sith, we could have schools of magic that represent those opposing forces. Maybe one school focuses on healing and nature magic, while another delves into shadow magic and manipulating life force.
Exactly. And lightsabers could become enchanted swords or axes that glow with magical energy. Maybe they're forged in a ritual, that binds the wielder's life force to the weapon, creating a powerful but potentially dangerous connection.
Ooh, that's
Yeah.
cool. And instead of blasters, we could have magical wands or staves that fire bolts of energy.
Exactly. And think about the different factions in Star Wars. You could easily translate the Empire into a tyrannical magocracy that rules through fear and oppression.
And the Rebel Alliance could become a band of freedom fighters who use their magical abilities to fight for justice and liberty.
And don't forget about those iconic creatures. You could easily reimagine Wookiees as a race of fierce but honorable forest dwellers, or reimagine stormtroopers as magically augmented soldiers, clad in enchanted armor.
This is making me realize that with a little creativity, we can adapt almost any film into a D&D setting.
Absolutely. It's all about understanding the core elements of the film, and then finding ways to translate those elements into a D&D context.
So we've talked about fantasy and sci-fi, but what about something even further removed from the typical D&D setting? What about a film like Avatar, which is so heavily focused on the environment and its connection to the characters?
Avatar is a brilliant example of how we can make the environment a central character in our D&D campaigns. Think about the lush forests of Pandora, the interconnectedness of all living things, and the conflict between nature and technology.
So instead of just having a generic forest as a setting, we could create a world where the trees are actually sentient beings, where the rivers flow with magical energy, and where the very air vibrates with ancient power.
Exactly. And the conflict in your campaign could revolve around a powerful corporation seeking to exploit the land for its resources, while the native inhabitants fight to protect their sacred home.
And the players get caught in the middle, forced to choose sides in a conflict that could have devastating consequences for the entire world.
Exactly. And think about how the environment itself could become a source of challenges and opportunities for the players. Maybe they have to navigate treacherous jungles filled with bioluminescent creatures, or they have to learn to communicate with the spirits of the forest to gain their aid.
Oh. And they could even have the ability to bond with animal companions, like the Na'vi do with their banshees.
I love that idea. It would create a unique dynamic and give the players a deeper connection to the world.
This is making me realize that the possibilities are truly endless when it comes to adapting movies for D&D. And I'm starting to get really excited about the potential for creating truly unique and memorable campaigns.
Me too. But before we get too carried away, let's take a step back and talk about the practicalities of running a movie-inspired campaign. Because it's one thing to have a great idea, but it's another thing entirely to actually execute it at the table.
That's a good point. So what are some tips and tricks for running a movie-inspired campaign smoothly and effectively?
One of the biggest things to remember is that pacing is key, both in prepping the campaign and during the sessions themselves. Think about how a movie builds tension, releases it, and then ramps it back up. You can apply those same principles to your D&D game.
So it's not just about throwing a bunch of movie-inspired encounters at the players. It's about creating a flow, a rhythm, a sense of narrative momentum that keeps them engaged.
Exactly, and that means being mindful of the pacing of individual sessions as well. You don't want to overwhelm the players with too much information or action at once. Give them time to breathe, to role play, to explore the world at their own pace.
But how do you do that when you're working with a pre-existing story? Because movies have a set runtime, a set narrative structure. How do we translate that into a D&D campaign? That can potentially span months or even years.
That's where your skill as a DM comes in. You're not adapting the movie scene for scene. You're taking those core elements and weaving them into a larger tapestry, a tapestry that unfolds organically as the players make choices and interact with the world.
So it's about finding that balance between structure and improvisation, between sticking to the source material and allowing the story to evolve in unexpected ways.
Precisely. You might start with a clear idea of where you want the campaign to go, but be prepared to deviate from that plan if the players take the story in a different direction.
So it's about being a facilitator, not a dictator. We're guiding the narrative, but we're also giving the players the freedom to make choices that have real consequences.
Exactly. And that's what makes D&D so special. It's a collaborative storytelling experience where everyone at the table contributes to the narrative.
Okay. I'm starting to see how we can approach this whole movie-inspired campaign thing. But what about the mechanics? How do we actually translate those cinematic concepts into D&D rules?
That's where your knowledge of the game system really comes into play. You need to be able to think creatively and find ways to represent those movie elements mechanically.
So if we're adapting a superhero film, for example, we might need to come up with some custom rules for superpowers. Or if we're adapting a horror film, we might need to create some unique monsters or environmental hazard.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to homebrew, to create your own rules or mechanics if the existing ones don't quite fit what you're trying to achieve.
That's a great point. It's about using the rules as a framework, but not letting them limit your creativity.
And remember, the goal is to create an experience that feels authentic to the source material, while still being fun and engaging for the players.
So if we're adapting a fast-paced action film, we want to make sure that combat encounters are dynamic and exciting. But if we're adapting a more cerebral thriller, we might want to focus more on puzzles, investigation, and social interaction.
Exactly. It's all about tailoring the mechanics to fit the tone and style of the film you're adapting.
Okay, I'm feeling much more confident about tackling this whole movie-inspired campaign thing. But there's one more thing I'm curious about. We've talked a lot about the DM's role in adapting a film, but what about the players? What can they do to enhance the cinematic feel of the game?
That's a great question. Because a truly cinematic D&D experience is a collaborative effort.
So it's not just about the DM setting the stage. It's about the players stepping into their roles and embracing the narrative.
Exactly. And there are several things players can do to enhance the cinematic feel of the game. First and foremost, they need to create compelling characters with rich backstories, motivations, and goals.
So it's about going beyond just picking a race in a class. It's about fleshing out those characters, giving them depth and personality.
Exactly. And when players have a deep understanding of their characters, they're more likely to make choices that are consistent with those characters' personalities, which can lead to more engaging and believable role-playing.
And when the role-playing is good, it's almost like watching a movie unfold in real time.
Precisely. And another thing players can do is to really think about their actions and how those actions impact the world around them.
So it's about thinking beyond just, what's the most optimal strategy for this encounter? It's about considering the consequences of their choices and how those choices will ripple through the story.
Exactly. Because in a cinematic campaign, every action has a reaction. And those reactions can sometimes lead to unexpected and exciting twists and turns.
So if the players decide to rob a bank, instead of rescuing the princess, that decision might have repercussions down the line. Maybe they become wanted criminals. Or maybe they inadvertently trigger a war between two powerful kingdoms.
Exactly. And those unintended consequences can make the campaign feel more dynamic and unpredictable, just like a good movie.
And let's not forget about the importance of description, because players can really contribute to the cinematic feel of the game by painting vivid pictures with their words.
Absolutely. When players describe their actions, their surroundings, and their emotions in detail, it helps to bring the world to life and create a more immersive experience for everyone at the table.
So instead of just saying, I attack the goblin, the player could say, I leap across the chasm, my sword flashing in the moonlight, and bring it down upon the goblin's head with a thunderous crash.
Exactly. That kind of descriptive language can really transport the players into the world and make them feel like they're part of a grand adventure.
And it's not just about describing actions. It's about describing emotions, too. Because when players share their characters' inner thoughts and feelings, it creates a deeper connection between the characters and the audience.
Exactly. And when those emotions are genuine and heartfelt, it can make the game truly unforgettable.
This is making me realize that creating a cinematic D&D experience is truly a team effort. It requires both the DM and the players to be fully invested in the story and to work together to bring it to life.
Absolutely. It's a collaboration, a partnership, a shared journey of imagination and discovery.
I'm feeling really pumped about this whole movie-inspired campaign thing. I'm ready to gather my players, choose a film, and start brainstorming. But before we wrap up, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on some specific genres that we haven't touched on yet.
Oh, I love diving into specific genres. What did you have in mind?
Well, first up, I'm thinking about superhero films because they seem so perfectly suited for D&D with their themes of extraordinary abilities, epic battles, and larger-than-life characters. But how do we translate those concepts into a tabletop game without it feeling like we're just playing a superhero RPG?
That's a great question. The key is to remember that D&D at its core is a fantasy game.
So when you're adapting a superhero film,
Right.
you need to find ways to ground those extraordinary abilities in a fantastical context.
So instead of having Iron Man's repulsor rays, maybe our character has a magical gauntlet that can fire bolts of energy. Or instead of having Spider-Man's web shooters, Maybe our character can conjure strands of enchanted silk
Yeah.
that can bind and entrap enemies.
Exactly, and you can draw inspiration from existing D&D classes and subclasses to represent those superheroic archetypes. A paladin could easily be reimagined as a Captain America-like figure, while a rogue could embody the stealth and agility of Black Widow.
And if you need to create some custom abilities or spells, don't be afraid to homebrew. You can even adapt existing spells to fit the superhero theme, for example. The fly spell could become superhuman leap, or the invisibility spell could become camouflage.
I love those ideas. And when it comes to designing encounters, think about the epic scale of superhero battles. Instead of just having the players fight a group of bandits, maybe they have to stop a giant robot from destroying the city, or they have to face off against a villain who can control the weather.
And when it comes to character motivations, think about the classic superhero dilemmas. Do they use their powers for personal gain, or do they dedicate their lives to protecting others? Do they keep their identities secret, or do they embrace their role as heroes?
Those moral quandaries can create some truly compelling role-playing opportunities and lead to some unexpected twists and turns in the narrative.
Okay, I'm officially sold on superhero campaigns. But what about adventure films? They seem like a natural fit for D&D, with their emphasis on exploration, treasure hunting, and daring feats. But how do we make sure that our adventure campaigns feel fresh and exciting, and not just like generic dungeon crawls?
That's where it's important to draw inspiration from the specific elements that make those adventure films so compelling. For example, if you're adapting an Indiana Jones film, think about the historical and mythological context of the artifacts he's seeking.
So instead of just having a generic magical sword, maybe it's an ancient relic that was once wielded by a legendary king, and it's said to hold the key to unlocking a forgotten realm.
Exactly. And think about the elaborate traps and puzzles that Indiana Jones has to overcome. You can create similar challenges in your D&D campaign, using your knowledge of the game system to design puzzles that are both challenging and entertaining.
Oh, and we can't forget about the chase scenes. Because a good adventure film always has at least one heart-pounding chase scene, whether it's through a bustling marketplace or across a treacherous jungle.
Absolutely. And you can easily recreate those chase scenes in a D&D context. Maybe the players are pursuing a villain through the crowded streets of a city, or they're trying to escape from a collapsing temple. You can use skill challenges, environmental hazards, and creative descriptions to make those chase scenes truly thrilling.
And don't forget about the importance of a memorable villain. Because a good adventure film always has a charismatic antagonist who's just as compelling as the hero.
Exactly. Think about villains like Balak from Raiders of the Lost Ark, or Davy Jones from Pirates of the Caribbean. They're not just mindless monsters. They're complex characters with their own motivations and goals.
So when you're designing your adventure campaign, make sure that the villain is more than just a generic evil overlord. Give them a personality, a backstory, a reason for doing what they do.
And make sure that their plans pose a real threat to the world. Because when the stakes are high, it raises the tension. It makes the players feel like their actions truly matter.
Okay, adventure campaigns are officially on my to-do list, but now I'm feeling a little brave. What about horror films? Because that seems like a genre that could be really challenging to adapt for D&D. How do you create a truly terrifying experience for players who can literally see the dice rolls and the stat blocks?
Horror in D&D is definitely a unique challenge, but it can be incredibly rewarding when done well. The key is to shift your focus from jump scares and gore to atmosphere, tension, and psychological horror.
So instead of just throwing a bunch of scary monsters at the players, we need to create a sense of dread, a feeling that something is lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike.
Exactly. Think about films like The Thing or The Shining. Those films are terrifying because they create a sense of paranoia and isolation, where the characters don't know who to trust or what's real.
So how do we create that same feeling in a D&D campaign?
One way is to use environmental storytelling. Instead of just describing a room as dark and dusty, describe the subtle signs of decay and neglect. Maybe there are cobwebs hanging from every corner. The air is thick with the smell of mildew, and you hear the faint scurrying of rats in the walls.
Ooh, that's already giving me the creeps. And what about the monsters? How do we make them truly terrifying?
Instead of just focusing on their physical stats, think about their psychological impact. Maybe they're creatures that can manipulate the players' minds, implanting false memories, or driving them to madness.
Oh, and we could use illusions and hallucinations to make the players question their own senses. Maybe they see a figure lurking in the corner of their eye, but when they turn to face it, there's nothing there.
Exactly. And don't forget about the power of sound. You can use music, sound effects, and even your own voice to create a truly chilling atmosphere.
Okay, I'm starting to see how we can bring the horror genre to life in a D&D campaign. But there's one more thing I'm curious about. What about cinematic techniques? Because we've talked a lot about adapting story elements from films, but what about adapting the way those stories are told?
That's a fantastic question. Because cinematic techniques like pacing, camera angles, and editing can be just as important as the story itself when it comes to creating a truly immersive experience.
So how do we translate those techniques into a tabletop game?
One way is to think about how you structure your sessions. Just like a film has a beginning, middle, and end, your sessions should have a clear narrative arc.
So instead of just saying, okay, we're starting the session now, what do you want to do? We might start with a dramatic opening scene that sets the stage for the adventure.
Exactly. You can use that opening scene to introduce the main conflict, establish the tone, and hook the player's attention.
And then as the session progresses, we can use pacing techniques to build tension, create suspense, and release those moments of excitement and catharsis.
Precisely. And don't be afraid to use cliffhangers. Just like a film might end a scene on a dramatic note, to keep the audience wanting more, you can end your sessions with a cliffhanger. That leaves the players eager to come back for the next installment.
Ooh, that's a great idea. And what about camera angles? Because films use different camera angles to create different effects. How do we achieve that same effect in a D&D game?
Well, you can use your descriptions to create a sense of perspective. For example, if you want to create a sense of grandeur and awe, you might describe a scene from a wide-angle perspective, taking in the vastness of the landscape or the towering height of a building.
So instead of just saying, you enter a large hall, we might say, you step through the towering archway and into a hall so vast that it seems to stretch on forever. The ceiling is lost in the shadows high above, and rows of massive pillars line the walls, each one carved with intricate design that tells stories of ancient battles and forgotten kings.
Exactly. And if you want to create a sense of intimacy or claustrophobia, you might describe a scene from a close-up perspective, focusing on the details of the characters' faces, their surroundings, or the objects they're interacting with.
So instead of just saying, you see a goblin lurking in the shadows, we might say, the goblin's eyes gleam like malevolent embers in the darkness, and its jagged teeth are bared in a snarl. You can smell the stench of its fetid breath as it inches closer, its claws scraping against the stone floor.
Exactly. And just like a film editor uses cuts and transitions to create a smooth and engaging flow, you can use pacing and scene transitions to keep your D&D game moving at a good clip.
So instead of just abruptly switching from one scene to the next, we might use a fade out or a crossfade to create a more seamless transition.
Exactly. And you can even use music and sound effects to enhance those transitions, just like a film score might swell or shift to signal a change in mood or setting.
Okay, this is all starting to make sense, but I have to admit, I'm a little overwhelmed by all these possibilities. It seems like a lot to keep in mind. When I'm trying to run a game...
I understand. It can definitely feel daunting at first.
Yeah.
But remember, you don't have to do everything at once. Start small. Pick one or two cinematic techniques that you want to focus on, and then gradually incorporate more as you gain confidence.
So maybe for my first movie-inspired campaign, I just focus on pacing and environmental storytelling. And then once I'm comfortable with those techniques, I can start experimenting with camera angles and scene transitions.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to ask your players for feedback. They might have some great ideas for how to enhance the cinematic feel of the game.
That's a great point, because a truly cinematic D&D experience is a collaborative effort.
Absolutely. And when you're all working together, drawing inspiration from those films you love, and letting your imaginations run wild, that's when the real magic happens.
This has been another amazing deep dive.
I am so excited to go and put all these ideas into practice.
Me too.
And I hope you all are too. So until next time, happy gaming.